Wyoming Territory. December 1888. She found him face down in the snow dying, frozen, and impossibly handsome. No one came, so she grabbed a sled rug and dragged him inside herself. Alone, in a killing blizzard. When he opened his eyes, his voice broke raw. "I owe you my life, ma'am." She looked at him, flower still on her cheek, fire steady in her eyes, and said quietly, "You owe me nothing." But the locked iron box, strapped to his saddle, held a secret that would shatter everything she'd ever built. This is the story of Gwenna Mercer and the snowstorm that brought her destiny to her door. Stay with me. Wyoming Territory. December 1888. The wind came down off the Rockies like something mean and personal. It didn't howl so much as shriek, rattling the pine shutters of Blackwood Pass cookhouse until every nail in the walls sang back at it. Snow hammered the windows in flat, horizontal sheets. The thermometer, nailed to the doorpost, had given up reading around supper time. Nobody needed numbers to know it was killing cold out there. Inside, it was something else entirely. Gwenna Mercer stood at her iron stove, broad-hipped and flour-dusted, stirring a pot of venison stew that had been going since morning. The cinnamon rolls on the top rack were just starting to blush golden at their edges. Pine logs crackled and popped in the firebox. The whole cookhouse smelled of warm spice and wood smoke, and something close to peace. She hummed while she worked. Not a real tune exactly, just a soft, wandering melody she'd made up years ago, watching her mother cook by the same kind of fire. Her rosy cheeks glowed in the firelight. Her dark hair, pinned loose at the back of her neck, had a few flower streaks in it she hadn't noticed yet. She didn't need to notice. There was nobody here to impress. This was her world, every inch of it. The cookhouse served as a way station for travelers cutting through the pass. Trappers, cattle hands, the occasional mail rider. Gwenna kept the larder stocked, the beds clean, and the fire never out. She'd built the regulars' trust one bowl of stew at a time. Not that everybody respected her for it. The women in Oakhaven, 12 miles south, down the mountain road, had made their opinions clear over the years. Too wide for fashionable corset, they said. Too plump to be proper, and too cheerful about it to be pitied, they whispered behind gloved hands at the mercantile, and made small comments with big smiles. Gwenna had heard every version of the joke by now. She never let it show. She just kept cooking. Because cooking was honest work, and honest work didn't care about your waistline. She pulled the cinnamon rolls from the oven and set them on the wooden rack to cool. Steam curled up off the glazed tops. Old Barnaby, her wood hauler, would want 2 of them when he stomped in from the shed. Little Ruthie, the 10-year-old sheep girl who had taken up unofficial residence in the back room, would want 3, then ask for a 4th, and pretend she hadn't already had 3. Gwenna smiled at that thought. Then the wind shifted. It went from a shriek to something lower, deeper, almost like a moan, and it raised the hairs on her arms right through her sleeve. She cocked her head and listened. The stew bubbled. The logs snapped. There it was again, a sound from outside. Not wind, something else. Gwenna wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window. She rubbed a circle clear in the frost on the glass and pressed her face close. Out in the yard, past the fence post, a dark shape lay in the white. A horse, down on its side. She grabbed her wool coat off the hook by the door, shoved her feet into her overshoes, and pulled the door open. The cold hit her like a wall. She gasped and bent into it, pushing out into the yard with one arm shielding her face. The snow was thigh-deep in places. She waded through, following the dark shape, until she reached the horse. The animal was still alive. She could see the flank heaving slow, the big brown eye blinking. It wasn't going to stand again tonight, not in this cold. And underneath it, pinned at the stirrup, was a man. She almost missed him at first. He was half buried in the drift, his dark coat nearly swallowed by the dark. But one gloved hand stuck up at an angle, and that was what caught her eye. Gwenna dropped to her knees beside him. She brushed the snow from his face with both hands. Lord help her. Even near dead and blue at the lips, this man was startlingly handsome. Sharp jaw, dark lashes resting against pale skin, features that looked like they'd been drawn by someone showing off. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse. Faint. But there. She looked back at the cookhouse door. 30 feet, maybe 35. Old Barnaby was in the woodshed, and she couldn't hear her own voice in this wind, much less shout loud enough to reach him. She was on her own. Gwenna moved fast. She waded back to the porch and grabbed the sled rug she kept rolled under the eave, a long, flat wooden sled she used to haul supply crates from the wagon. She dragged it back to the man and dropped it flat beside him. Getting him onto it was the hard part. She didn't have brute strength to spare, and she knew that. So she worked smart instead of hard. She rolled him first onto his side, then used the sled as a ramp and let gravity ease him flat onto it. She wedged his boots against the sled's upturned lip so he wouldn't slide off. Then she looped the pull rope over her shoulder, leaned forward at the hips, and dug her heels into the snow. The sled moved, inch by inch at first, then steadier. She kept her weight low and her center forward, the way her father had taught her when they used to move grain barrels together. Her thighs burned, her shoulders ached. The snow pushed back against every step. She didn't stop. She got him to the porch, got him up, the 2 steps, with a scrambling effort that left her gasping on her knees. Got him through the door and into the warmth of the cookhouse, dragging him close to the iron furnace, and went running for the quilts. She had 4 heavy quilts stored in the cedar chest. She'd run them through the oven that morning to air out, warm, dry, smelling faintly of cedar and clean cotton. She piled them over him now, tucking the edges under his shoulders and feet, and then fed the furnace 3 more logs until it roared. She knelt beside him, close to the floor where the heat pooled heaviest, and watched his color. His lips were still gray. Even through the gloves, his hands were ice. She pulled the gloves off and sandwiched his hands between hers, chafing gently, coaxing the blood back. It took a long time. Slowly, the gray started to pink. His breathing deepened. His brow shifted from slack to something that looked like effort. Gwenna sat back on her heels and let out a breath she'd been holding for 10 minutes. She became aware that her knees hurt, that her coat was soaked clean through, and that the cinnamon rolls on the rack had gone completely cold. She looked at the man in the firelight. She looked at the locked iron box still strapped to his saddlebag, which had ridden in on the sled with him. She took in the weary, hard-traveled look of his coat and boots. He'd come a long way in the cold to end up here. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd come from, or what trouble might be riding behind him. In a storm like this, none of that mattered yet. He was alive. He was warm. He was going to stay that way. Gwenna stood up, smoothed her apron, and went to reheat the stew. That was what you did for a person. You brought them in from the cold. You fed the fire. You waited until they woke up to ask the questions. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the walls of the cookhouse. Inside, it was warm. He woke to the smell of coffee, dark and strong, with something underneath it, cinnamon or vanilla, or the ghost of both baked into the walls from years of winter mornings. The ceiling above him was rough pine planking, the knots dark and round in the grain. Firelight moved across the boards in slow, rolling waves. He lay still and took stock. Fingers first, toes, ribs tender along the left side where something had caught him going down. Everything ached. Everything answered. He turned his head and found the window, white from the frame to the sky, solid and still moving. A woman moved across the room. She had her back to him, working at the iron stove. Round-figured, soft-curved, with dark hair pinned loose at the back of her neck and a wide white apron tied behind her in a half-undone bow. Her movements were settled and easy, with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this particular sequence of tasks in this particular kitchen so many times that her hands no longer needed instructions. She reached for the ladle without looking. She tilted the stove lid with the exact amount of wrist the thing required. She knew every inch of this place, and it showed in every motion. She was humming, barely, a soft, wandering thread of sound, barely audible under the crackle of the wood stove. She didn't seem to know she was doing it. Thad pushed himself up on one elbow. The quilts fell away. The woman turned at the sound. She startled a quick, silent inhale, and then her face went warm, a real smile, wide, across the cheeks with dark eyes that brightened at the corners and caught the firelight whole. There was a small dusting of flour on her left cheek she hadn't noticed yet. "You're awake," she said. "I am." His voice came out rough, scraped, and dry. He swallowed. "I wasn't certain I would be. I had the same uncertainty for a few hours." She crossed the room with a tin mug of coffee and a bowl of something steaming. "Drink first. Eat when you're ready. Your boots are by the furnace. I dried them last night." He took the mug with both hands and drank. He'd had coffee across 4 states and 2 territories in the past year. Weak, watery trail coffee that barely colored the water. Thick, burnt hotel coffee in Cheyenne that cost too much and delivered very little. This cup was something else. Dark and balanced, rich without tipping into bitterness, strong enough to remind a man what mornings were supposed to feel like. "That's the best coffee I've had in months," he said. She settled into the rocking chair by the hearth, folding her hands in her lap. "Same beans as always. Cold weather makes everything taste better. A small beat, and it makes you grateful in a way that sticks." He looked at her over the rim of the mug. That was a true thing said simply, without working to make a point of it. He found he liked that immediately. "I'm Thad," he said, "Thaddeus Sterling, and I owe you my life, ma'am." "You owe me nothing," she said it matter-of-factly, without false modesty or any obvious desire for credit. Just how it was. "I'm Gwenna. Everyone calls me Gwen." A pause short, barely a beat, but he felt it. Gwen the cook, if they want something more. No family name, he noticed. He kept it to himself. He ate slowly, working through the stew in measured spoonfuls. Rich broth, venison that had gone tender and deep after hours of slow cooking. Root vegetables cut, even so they all finished at the same time. Every element considered. Gwenna sat in the rocking chair and gave him the room to eat without filling the quiet. Most people couldn't manage that, especially with a stranger in the house and a blizzard at the walls. She lived in the silence comfortably, the way you live in a house you've stopped having to think about. "How long was I out?" he asked. "Through the night, and most of this morning." She glanced at the window. Still white outside, still pressing flat against the glass. "Storm hasn't shifted much. Your horse is in the lean-to-my wood hauler, Barnaby. Got her in at first light." She was cold but standing. Thad let out a slow breath. 4 years he'd had that horse. Good, steady animal. "I'm grateful to Barnaby. Tell him when you see him. He'll shrug it off, but it'll matter." A voice spoke from the corner of the room. "Her back left shoe is loose." Thad looked over. A girl sat on the top bunk near the window, 10 years old, maybe, with a wild mess of dark curls and the flat, unsentimental stare of a child who had grown up around animals rather than people. She held a tin cup in both hands and watched him with the calm attention of someone conducting a thorough evaluation. "Left rear shoe," she said, pulling away at the toe. "Needs resetting before the thaw, or she'll throw it on the ice road and pull up lame." "You looked at her feet this morning?" Thad asked. "I always look at the feet first." She blew on her cup. "I'm Ruthie, Thad." One firm nod. Then she turned back to the window. Gwenna caught his eye. The very edge of a smile crossed her face. It said, plainly enough, "You get used to her." He looked around the cookhouse more carefully while he finished eating. The place had real intelligence behind it. Shelves organized by a system that reflected actual use cooking staples at arm height, preserved goods below, lighter jars above. Cookbooks on the far wall with cracked spines and pages that fell open to their most visited sections. The margins annotated in a slanted, precise hand. A leather repair kit on the counter, proper harness needles, a bone awl, a block of beeswax for weatherproofing. Measuring cords on a hook beside a carpenter's square. A small log of accounts near the window, open to the current page. This wasn't a woman scraping by in a hard place. This was a woman who had thought carefully about every tool she needed, found it, and kept it in working order. The cookhouse was a kind of argument for competence, for self-sufficiency, for the quiet dignity that comes from doing difficult work with real skill. When he finished eating, he set the bowl on the table and looked across the room at his gear. The iron box sat beside his saddlebag against the far wall. Dark iron, roughly the size of a bread loaf, with a keyhole on the front plate and a latch that had stiffened and darkened with age and weather. He'd carried it since Missouri, 4 months of mountain riding, 2 storms, a near drowning at a river crossing he didn't like to think about, and finally the Wyoming blizzard that had very nearly finished everything. His father had left it with a letter. The letter was careful, the language of a man who had held something private for a long time and wasn't sure, even at the end, how much to say. The main point was plain. There was an old debt, carried across 2 generations, owed to a family at Blackwood Pass. The name in the letter was Mercer. The box held the settlement. Thad was the one to deliver it. He'd tried the lock twice in the first week of riding. The iron was solid and real. Whoever held the key was somewhere in these mountains. Gwenna's eyes had gone to the box. "That came in with you," she said, "on the sled. I left it beside your bag." "I know," he met her gaze. "You didn't open it. It wasn't mine. Thank you for that." He paused. Then he told her the short version of the story, his father's October death, the letter, the debt, the name Mercer. He watched her face while he talked. She listened without interrupting, without filling his pauses with anxious sounds of agreement. She just heard him out entirely. When he finished, the room held quiet for a moment. "Mercer," she said. "That's the name." She looked at the fire. Her hands were still in her lap. Her expression was calm and level, but it was carefully so, the kind of calm that takes some work to maintain. "It's a common name," she said. "I don't know anyone by it at the pass. It's been me and Barnaby and Ruthie for 3 winters running." He studied the side of her face in the firelight. Whatever she was holding close, she was holding it well. He didn't push. "I'll try Oakhaven when the road opens," he said. Something moved through her expression then, brief and then gone. "You can try," she said, with a faint edge at the word Oakhaven that she didn't explain and he didn't ask about. By mid-afternoon, he was on his feet, still stiff at the edges, but upright and functional. He found Gwenna in the root cellar, checking the stores by lamplight, lifting jars to the flame to check for cloudiness or failed seals, sorting by what needed eating first against what could hold another month. She talked through her logic as she worked, thinking out loud. The turnips wanted eating this week. The dried squash was fine through February. The salt pork was solid. The smoked venison wanted watching. He shifted the heavier crates without being asked and listened to her reasoning. There was a whole system underneath her decisions: intake dates held in memory, consumption rates calculated against the size of the household, buffer stock sized against how long a bad storm could close the mountain road. "You manage all this in your head," he said. "Mostly, I write down what matters." She set a jar of dried apples on the front shelf. "The goal is to never be surprised by what runs out. Most operations this size have a bookkeeper." She looked at him briefly. "I am the bookkeeper." He helped her until the cellar was organized to her satisfaction. In the late afternoon, he split wood while the flat, pale light lasted, filling the evening stack until it was tight and orderly under the eave. He came inside to find Gwenna at the work table with her accounts ledger, a column of figures running down the left margin in that same precise hand. She glanced up when he came through the door, registered the full wood stack through the window behind him, and went back to the page. That was enough. Barnaby came in from the shed at dusk, wide-built, gray-bearded, with a slight stoop and a face that had been lived in hard. He looked Thad over the way a man looks at something he's going to have to make a decision about. "Sterling," he said.
"That's right. She drag you in on the rug?"
"She did." Barnaby considered this. "Big one to drag," he said. Not a compliment exactly. More logistical observation, then sat down and reached for the cornbread. Barnaby, Gwenna said. Just noting it, he said. Ruthie provided her evening report on the horse over supper. Thad swept the floor. Gwenna washed the dishes, and Ruthie dried with the focused gravity of someone who took drying dishes seriously. Barnaby sat by the fire with his pipe and observed everything with the air of a man reserving his final verdict. After Ruthie went to bed, and Barnaby's breathing slowed behind his curtain, Thad sat across from Gwenna at the hearth. She was mending a wool blanket with small, even stitches, the needle moving in a quiet, unhurried rhythm. He thought about every woman he'd sat across a fire with over the years. Women in Denver drawing rooms and Cheyenne hotel parlors who had been raised to be ornamental and knew it, who arranged themselves in firelight the way they arranged themselves everywhere, deliberately, with one eye on the room. He didn't blame them. That was the game they'd been handed. But he'd never found anything in it to hold on to. There was none of that here. Gwenna was just at her own hearth, in her own house, mending something that needed mending, entirely present, and entirely herself. And somebody he was growing sure of it had spent real effort, making her feel like that wasn't good enough. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up. "You like it up here? Just the three of you. This far from anywhere." She considered it honestly. "I like that the work is mine," she said. "In town, people have opinions about everything. How a woman ought to look, how much space she should take up, what shape she ought to be." She said a careful stitch. "Up here, nobody cares. I cook, and the food says what I am." Thad looked at her. He held the words for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to say them right. "In the city," he said, "women cinch corsets tight to fit a mold. But you, Gwenna, you carry the beauty of a warm hearth in winter, sweet, genuine, and glowing." She looked up at him sharply, checking whether he meant it. He held her gaze, steady and even. He meant every syllable, and he'd have said it again without changing a word. Her cheeks went rosy in the firelight, something warmer than the fire, and she looked back down at the blanket in her lap. "You should rest," she said. "You nearly died yesterday. You keep reminding me, because you keep forgetting." He smiled. "Good night, Gwenna." "Good night, Thad." Outside, the blizzard pressed hard against the walls. The fire burned low and steady inside. In the particular silence between two people who have started, without quite meaning to trust each other, the night settled in. The storm had been running for 3 days. Outside the cookhouse, the mountain pass had gone entirely white. Not just snow-covered swallowed. The fence posts were buried to their crossbars. The lean-to roof held a snowpack that Barnaby went out twice daily to knock loose before it buckled. The trail down to Oak Haven was a theoretical thing, something remembered but not visible, buried under 3 feet of drifted Wyoming winter. Inside, the cookhouse ran on its own clock. Fire-fed, water-hauled, meals made, and eaten. The rhythm of it was a kind of comfort, not what you'd call excitement, but the steadier thing underneath excitement that most people didn't value until they needed it. Ruthie was at the back room table. With the arithmetic primer Gwenna assigned her whenever storms kept them closed in. She worked through it with a sheep shearer's patience slowly, without complaint, pausing occasionally to announce that a particular problem was unrealistic, or that whoever had written the book clearly did not understand practical mathematics. Barnaby was in the woodshed, doing whatever Barnaby did out there, which Gwenna had long decided was private business she had no need to investigate. That left the kitchen to Gwenna and Thad. She pulled out the large ceramic bowl on the morning of the 3rd day and set it on the work table with a solid, decisive thump. Then she opened the flour bin winter wheat, milled dense and full-bodied, and started measuring. Not the quick daily batch for supper. The heavy, slow-rise winter bread, 4 big loaves that would keep a week, that could sustain real work, that were worth the hour of effort they asked for. Thad appeared in the kitchen doorway with a full water bucket from the cistern. "Barnaby's arms are bothering him," he said. "I did the morning carry." She looked at the bucket, then at him. He'd been up before the light again. She could tell by the cold air still on his coat. "Roll your sleeves," she said, "and wash your hands. You can help." He did both. No questions asked, then stood at the counter beside her and waited. She handed him the work as she went proof the yeast in warm water, while she sifted the flour, add the salt, hold that bowl steady while she poured. She talked through the process the way she always cooked, thinking out loud without making a lesson of it. He listened and followed, and didn't offer opinions he hadn't been asked for, which was rarer than it should have been. "Winter bread needs more flour than summer bread," she said, measuring out the ratio. "Cold air fights the rise. You have to give the dough more structure to push against." "The cold makes everything harder," he said. "It makes everything stronger if you let it." He glanced at her. She was looking at the flour, not at him. They mixed the dough together, trading the wooden spoon back and forth until the mixture thickened and stiffened and could no longer be stirred. Gwenna turned it out onto the flour-dusted kneading board in a heavy, rough mass. She sprinkled flour over the top and pressed her palm into it. "Heel of the hand," she said. "Push forward, fold back, quarter turn. You commit to it, or the center comes out gummy." She started working the dough, putting her weight behind each push. It resisted dough, always did at first, always fought back before it yielded, and she leaned into it with both arms. Thad watched for a moment. Then he stepped in behind her. He came close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back, and reached around to set his hands over hers on the dough. Large hands, work-ruined, fingers long and certain. They covered hers completely. He found the motion: push, fold, turn, and his breath was warm and close at the curve of her neck. "Like this?" he said, low and near her ear. Gwenna's hand stopped for 1/2 second. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. They worked the dough together. Push, fold, quarter turn. His chest was near her shoulder, and his arms framed hers, and the motion was slow and rhythmic, like something unhurried and deliberate. The dough began to smooth under their hands, the rough, shaggy mass going silky and elastic as the gluten built and the yeast started waking. The vanilla extract she'd left open on the counter sent its warm, sweet scent through the kitchen. Underneath it was the yeasty bloom of the rising dough and the pine wood smoke from the stove, and the faint cold air smell still caught in Thad's hair. He leaned in slightly to watch their hands. Heat climbed up the back of Gwenna's neck, slowly, and it had nothing to do with the oven. She had cooked in this kitchen her whole adult life. She had fed trappers and cattle hands and mail riders, and any cold stranger who came through the pass. She had been capable and competent and efficient, and she had done all of it without anyone standing close to her, like this, close enough that she could feel warmth at her shoulder, close enough that a man's voice near her ear was a low, careful thing. The women of Oakhaven would have found it funny, probably. Gwen the cook, too soft, too wide, too much of everything they spent considerable effort not being. They cinched themselves into shape and presented themselves correctly and earned their place in a room by taking up the right amount of it. But right now, with flour on her hands and dough under her palms and warm breath near her ear, Gwenna felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, possibly ever. Cherished was the only word that fit. Like she was something worth standing close to. Thad eased back after a moment and gave her room. He took the far side of the dough and kneaded independently, and they worked in easy quiet for a while, the board between them, the dough going smooth and supple. "You're good at this," he said. "Years of practice, I mean at everything." He pressed the heel of his palm forward and folded the cellar inventory, the accounts, the repair work on the window frame, the way you run this place. He glanced at her. "Most people I've met are good at one thing, maybe two. You're good at all of it." She kept her eyes on the dough. "You learn what you have to." Or, he said, "some people are built capable, and they rise to whatever's asked of them." A pause. "You're one of those." She had no ready answer for that. When the dough had come together, smooth and elastic and ready, she shaped it into a round and set it in the greased bowl to rise, laying a damp cloth over the top. They washed their hands at the basin. The blizzard pushed at the walls outside, and the cookhouse fire burned its quiet, even heat. Gwenna poured coffee and brought the cups to the table. They sat across from each other with the covered bowl between them, and the morning still stretching out ahead. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Go ahead." "All this writing. 4 months over 4 mountain ranges on the word of a letter." She met his eyes. "Are you always the kind of man who honors a debt that wasn't even his?" He thought about it for a real moment. "My father was," he said. "I used to think that was just who he was. Now I think maybe it was a choice he made over and over, long enough that it became who he was." A pause. "I'm still deciding which way I fall." She nodded. "Let it sit." He turned his mug. "Can I ask you something?" She lifted her chin. "Go ahead." "The women in Oakhaven," he said carefully. "You mentioned it the other night, what a woman ought to look like, how much space she ought to take up. How long has that been going on?" Her eyes went to the window, white outside and still moving. "Since I was old enough to notice," she said. "My mother was built like me, soft-figured, broad through the shoulders, always more than what a fashionable corset could accommodate." She turned her coffee cup slowly. In town, that was something people felt entitled to comment on. The mercantile women, the church-going women, the ones who could cinch themselves into the right shape and made sure you knew they'd managed it. She set the cup down. "They were very thorough about making clear that I was wrong somehow. Built wrong." "Psych-side wrong." Thad said nothing. He listened without filling the space. "It shouldn't still get to me," she said. "I've been up here 3 winters. Nobody up here cares what shape I am. The bread doesn't care. The fire doesn't care. The travelers I've kept warm and fed don't care." She smoothed a fold in her apron. "But sometimes someone comes through from town, or a word gets up the mountain road, and it—" She stopped. "It gets in. Even when you know it's nonsense." "You do know it's nonsense," he said mostly. A small wry smile. "Mostly I know what these hands can do. I know who ate through the last 3 winters because of what I made. I know this cookhouse runs because I run it." She spread her flour-dusty palms on the table, flat and matter-of-fact. "That's not a small thing." "No," he said. "It's not small at all." She looked at him across the table. "Then, because fairness went both ways, and you're a handsome man, Thad, anyone can see it. Does that make things easier?" He laughed a real short laugh, a little dry. "Some things easier," he said. "Other things very strange." He leaned back in his chair. "In the city, people see the face and think they already know everything underneath it. Women wanted to be seen with me because it reflected well on them. Men wanted to compete with me or use me as an accessory to their own social situation. Nobody much asked what I wanted because they'd already decided what I was." "And what did you want?" He was quiet for a moment. The bread dough rose slowly under its cloth. The fire crackled once and settled. "A home," he said. "Something real. People who knew me past the first impression." He looked at the cookhouse around him, the ordered shelves, the cracked cookbooks, the arithmetic primer on the back room table, the patched window frame, the iron stove that had kept a dying stranger alive through a Wyoming blizzard. "I've been in a lot of places. I haven't been in many places like this." Gwenna was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, crossed to the bowl, and lifted the cloth to check the dough. It had risen a full inch, the surface smooth and slightly domed. Right on time. What the women of Oakhaven thought about Gwenna's figure, and what the city drawing rooms thought about Thad's face, none of that had anything to do with what was real. Real was the bread rising in the bowl. Real was the fire burning honest heat. Real was 2 people who had been judged by their outsides all their lives, sitting across a table in a snowstorm, finally being seen the right way around. True beauty was not a measurement. It was not a silhouette or a fashionable corset or the right kind of face in the right kind of room. It was this, the capacity to make something warm out of nothing, to feed people who were cold, to stay when staying was hard, and to treat a near-dead stranger like he was worth saving. That was what Gwenna was made of. Another 40 minutes on the rise, she said, covering the bowl again. I'll split more wood. You don't have to. The stack could use it. He was already rolling his sleeve. She let him go. She stood at the table for a moment with her hands on the cloth-covered bowl, feeling the slow, warm rise under her palms. Outside, the blizzard hadn't quit. But inside the cookhouse, in the flower-scented warmth of an ordinary morning, something between two people was rising, just as quietly steadier than either of them had planned, and just about as hard to stop. The storm broke on the fourth day. Not fully. Wyoming January didn't do anything fully or gently, but the shrieking edge went out of the wind, and the snow thinned from a wall to a curtain. By mid-morning, pale gray light came through the cookhouse windows for the first time in days. Barnaby went out and pronounced the yard passable. Ruthie took the sheep out to the lean-to yard and stood among them in the cold air, with her face turned up, blinking at the sky. Gwenna opened the front door and stood on the porch, breathing the clean, hard air. The pass was white and silent. In every direction, the pine trees bent under their snow loads. The mountain road a smooth and unmarked line of white that could have been a road or a creek bed or nothing at all. Beautiful and very still. She went back inside to start lunch. She had a pot of bean soup on the stove, by 11 smoked pork hock, dried beans that had been soaking since morning, onion, a bay leaf, a little dried thyme from the summer bundle still hanging above the window. The cast iron skillet sat on the back burner with a round of cornbread going in it, lid on, the bottom already set and golden. Thad was at the table with her ledger, going through the supply numbers she'd mentioned, needing to cross-check. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply noticed the ledger open, noticed she was occupied at the stove, and sat down with a pencil to find the discrepancy in the February column she'd mentioned the evening before. He had a quiet, purposeful way of making himself useful that she was starting to rely on without quite admitting it. Ruthie was bringing feed to the sheep. Barnaby was in the shed. Everything was ordinary and calm, and that was precisely when the horses came. Gwenna heard them before she saw them, hooves crunching over the packed snow of the yard, more than 2 horses, moving at a deliberate pace. She crossed to the window and wiped the glass clear. 3 men on horseback, dark coats. One of them carried a repeating rifle loose across his saddle. They weren't mail riders. They weren't trappers. They moved with the particular loose confidence of men who were used to arriving at places and not being told to leave. Thad, she said. He was already up. The door opened before either of them could reach it, and the 3 men came into the cookhouse without knocking. Cold air rolled in behind them. They tracked snow across the swept floor and looked around the room with the idle, unhurried eyes of people who had already decided what a place was worth. The one in front was heavyset, with a thick black mustache and a sheriff's deputy star pinned crooked on his coat. He looked at Thad first, then at Gwenna. His eyes went up and down, once slow, with a meanness behind them that was practiced and deliberate. Well, he said to the man behind him, this is the way station, not much of one. A pause, and look at the cook. Must be her own best customer. The other 2 laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't particularly creative. It was the low, comfortable laugh of men who had done this before, who knew exactly what they were delivering, and had long since stopped needing a reason for it. Thad's right hand moved to his hip. Gwenna's hand came out and caught his forearm. Hard, deliberate, clear. She looked straight at him for 1 full second. Her eyes said, not you. This is mine. She stepped forward. The soup pot was on the stove behind her, bubbling steadily, steam rising from the lid. The cast iron skillet was on the back burner, heavy and solid and already warm to the touch. She picked up the skillet in one hand and rested it against her hip, easy as carrying a market basket. She put her other hand on the soup ladle. She looked at the deputy. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Your crude words won't ruin my baking, she said. Get out before I douse you with boiling broth. The room went quiet. The deputy's smile faded at the edges. He looked at the pot. He looked at the skillet. He looked at Gwenna's face, calm, clear-eyed, entirely settled on what she was prepared to do. He took a half step back without appearing to notice he'd done it. "We're not here for you, Cook," he said, recovering some of his bluster. "We're here for him." He pointed at Thad. "Sheriff Blackwood wants a word." "The sheriff can come himself," Thad said. "I don't speak to messengers. You'll speak when he says speak." The deputy's jaw tightened. "You've got something he needs. That box you've been hauling around." He glanced at the iron box on the shelf against the wall. "Sterling name on a deed is what he's after. You sign off on the pass access. Before March, everybody walks away happy." Thad didn't move or speak. Gwenna watched the deputy's face. He'd said more than he'd meant to. She could see it in the way. His eyes flicked sideways at the other two men, a quick, checking look. "Before March," she said. "Why March?" The deputy shut his mouth. But the man on the right, younger, shoulders up near his ears from the cold, less practiced at keeping things behind his eyes, answered without meaning to. "Circuit judge comes through in March. Once he's here, it's too late to file on." "Enough," the deputy's voice cut across the room. "Too late." Gwenna filed it away. "The circuit judge March, filing on something." She kept her face level and her hand on the ladle. "Union Pacific," Thad said, very quiet. He was looking at the deputy now with a particular stillness, like a man rereading a map he thought he understood. "The railroad. They're routing through the pass." The deputy said nothing, which was by itself an answer. Thad nodded slowly. "And Blackwood needs the land clear before the judge can review any outstanding claims. So he needs my name on something that transfers Sterling's share, and he needs it before March." The younger man looked at his boots. The deputy squared his shoulders. "You'll be hearing from the sheriff direct," he said. "That's all I came to say." He looked at Gwenna once more, with less boldness this time. "Cook." They left. The door closed behind them. Snow on the floorboards, two sets of muddy tracks, and the quiet sound of horses moving back up the yard. Thad stood at the window and watched them go. Gwenna set the skillet back on the burner. She let out a long, steady breath. "They work for Blackwood," she said. "He's the sheriff of Oakhaven." "You know him?" She turned back to the stove. "Everyone in a 20-mile radius knows Ephraim Blackwood," she said. "He has opinions about what belongs to him." She stirred the soup. "Slow circles. Pass is on Sterling land?" "Half of it. The other half was under a family agreement, the Sterlings and a partner family. Shared access deed. My father's letter mentioned it, but not the details." He turned from the window. The box might have the paperwork. The iron box on the shelf caught the gray light from the window. Gwenna looked at it. Then at Thad. "A circuit judge in March," she said carefully. "That means whatever Blackwood is trying to file, whatever he's trying to claim, it won't hold if the judge sees a legitimate competing claim first." Thad met her eyes. "No," he said, "it won't." They looked at each other across the room for a moment. Then Gwenna turned back to the soup and added another pinch of thyme, and neither of them said what both of them were thinking, because the blizzard might have paused, but the danger hadn't. It had just introduced itself. Night came down fast and hard. The brief pause in the storm folded back into full winter by late afternoon, clouds piling in from the northwest, the temperature dropping 30 degrees between sundown and dark. Barnaby latched the shutters. Ruthie brought the last of the sheep into the lean-to and came in stomping snow off her boots. Supper was quiet. The visit from Blackwood's men sat in the room with them like a fourth person at the table. Gwenna served the bean soup and cornbread, and nobody said much. Barnaby ate with his eyes down, chewing slow, the way he did when he was thinking hard. Ruthie watched Thad through the steam rising off her bowl. "They'll come back," Ruthie said. "Probably," Thad said. "At night," she said. "That's what bad men do. Wait until the fire's low," with the flat certainty of a child who had seen enough of the world to have already formed accurate opinions about it. Nobody argued with her. Gwenna cleared the table and banked the fire for the night. She checked the lock on the front door, solid, and the bar on the back. She set the iron skillet on the hearth within reach. Thad pulled his bedroll close to the door and lay on it with his boots on. and the iron box on the floor beside him. Ruthie went to her bunk, Barnaby to his. The storm built outside, slow and steady, pressing back against the walls. At some point deep in the night, Gwenna slept. The smell woke her. Not the ordinary wood smoke that had been her companion every winter night for 3 years. This was different, sharper, wrong, carrying the bite of something structural, burning. Tar, treated pine, the cookhouse walls. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Fire! Thad's voice came from across the room, low and urgent, already moving. On the north wall, there outside, orange light bloomed in the window. Not firelight from inside. Firelight from outside, moving up the exterior wall, climbing fast toward the eave. Someone had set the wall, and the lean-to was already catching. Ruthie! Gwenna crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled the girl out of the bunk. Barnaby. Up. Barnaby was already up. The old man moved fast when it mattered. Gwenna had seen it before, boots on, coat grabbed, the blanket chest dragged back from the wall in case they needed it. Thad hit the door. He got it open, cold air slamming in with the smell of smoke, and went out fast into the darkness, going for the north wall to find the source. Gwenna pulled Ruthie to the door. "Stay with Barnaby," she said. "Don't come out unless I say." She grabbed her coat, the ledger, the sled rug by the door, pure reflex, her hands knowing what her mind would have thought of a second later. She got outside. The north wall was burning in earnest, and in the shadow. And orange chaos of it, she could see 2 shapes moving at the tree-line, men with torches, and a third figure closer, near the corner of the building. Thad was at the corner. He had one of them by the collar, then a shot. It came from the tree line, a hard, flat crack, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Thad spun. He came between Gwenna and the tree line in one motion, fast and deliberate, putting his back to the shooter. The bullet hit him in the chest, high and left. She heard the impact, felt it as a sound before she understood what she was seeing. He went down to one knee. Then he got back up, 2 more steps forward. Then his legs stopped working right, and he went down sideways into the snow, one hand stretched out, catching himself. Gwenna was beside him. Her hands were on him, checking the wound in the dark, and the firelight, and the impossible noise of the building burning behind her. The iron box was still on the floor inside. She saw it through the open door, the door swinging in the wind, the room beyond it filling with smoke. The box, knocked from the bedroll in the chaos, had hit the corner of the stone hearth on its way down. The lock had broken. The lid hung open at an angle, papers inside, and one sheet already half out, caught in the draft, moving between the door and the burning wall, sliding across the floor toward the light. She went in for it. 1 breath of smoke, 2 steps, snatched the papers off the floor, and came back out. She looked at what was in her hand. The fire lit it clearly enough. An old parchment heavy paper, folded twice and sealed with wax that had cracked along the fold. She opened it there in the firelight. And smoke, Thad bleeding into the snow beside her, the cookhouse burning at her back. The heading was formal, legal language, dated 1871. She read it fast, the way you read something, when your stomach has already told you what it says. A betrothal contract, Thaddeus Merritt, Sterling, to Gwenna Ruth Mercer, to settle the debt of account between the Sterling and Mercer families of Blackwood Pass territory. The girl to be delivered to the Sterling household upon her coming of age or upon mutual agreement between the contracting parties, as settlement in full. Delivered. Gwenna stood very still in the snow. Delivered. Like a crate of flour. Like a supply order. Like something owed. She looked at Thad, bleeding and half-conscious at her feet. Sharp jaw. Deep blue eyes now closed. Lashes against pale skin. The face she had thought she was beginning to read. The face she had let herself believe was seeing her truly for the first time in her life, in the honest way she had been waiting to be seen. Had he known? Had every warm word by the fire been a man navigating toward a transaction? Had you carry the beauty of a warm hearth in winter been a strategy charm, the woman, soften the terms, deliver the box, and collect the settlement? The cookhouse gave a long, low groan behind her. The north wall fell inward. Sparks went up into the dark sky in a slow, rising column, carried sideways by the wind. Everything she had built, 3 winters of wood stacked and meals cooked and a found family kept warm. The ledger was in her coat pocket. She'd grabbed it, but the cinnamon rolls were burning. The cookbooks, with their cracked spines and annotated margins, were burning. The winter rations in the root cellar, the quilts from the cedar chest, the little sprigs of dried thyme above the window. All of it. Ruthie materialized at her elbow, silent and quick. The girl looked at Thad, then at the contract in Gwenna's hands, then at the burning building. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed the sled rug from where it had dropped and looked at Gwenna. Gwenna folded the contract and pushed it into her coat pocket, next to the ledger, next to her heartbreak and her fury, and all the questions she didn't have answers to yet. She dropped to her knees beside Thad. "Help me roll him," she said. They got him onto the sled. Gwenna looped the rope over her shoulder and leaned forward the same way she had 5 days ago, in the blizzard, in what felt like another life. Her thighs burned. Her shoulders took the weight. Ruthie pushed from behind, small hands pressing at Thad's shoulder, feet digging into the snow. Barnaby appeared from the darkness, having gotten the horse clear of the burning lean-to. He took the rope without a word and added his weight to the pull. Together they moved into the tree line, away from the heat and the light, and the men who had done this, deeper into the black pine, dark, and the blizzard, and the cold that had no mercy and did not care. Gwenna didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the white ahead of her, and her hand pressed hard against Thad's chest wound, feeling his heartbeat under her palm still there, faint and fast, but still there. She felt the folded parchment through the fabric of her coat pocket. Was he dying from blood loss or shame? Was she saving the man she loved, or a man who had looked at her and seen a debt with a face on it? She didn't know. She kept pulling. The blizzard closed behind them, swallowing the light of the burning cookhouse, piece by piece, until there was nothing behind them but white and wind and the dark. The cave was shallow and low-ceilinged, a pocket of granite carved out of the hillside by water or time, or both. Barely enough room to stand upright at the center. Cold stone floor, a narrow opening, walls dark with old smoke from whoever had sheltered here before them. A hunter's cave used, abandoned, forgotten by everyone except the weather. Barnaby knew it. He led them to it, without hesitation, the horse trailing behind through the deep snow, Thad draped across the sled. By the time they got through the opening, Gwenna's arms were shaking from the effort, and her breath was coming in short, hard pulls. Ruthie found dry wood stacked in the back. Whoever left it last had left it well. Barnaby got the fire, going with 2 strikes of the flint, while Gwenna cleared the floor and spread the blankets they'd managed to save. 1 horse blanket from Thad's gear. 2 wool blankets grabbed off Barnaby's bed in the chaos, thin but dry. They laid Thad close to the fire, and Gwenna went to work. She'd seen bullet wounds before. Her father had dealt with 2 of them over the course of her childhood, 1 on a hired hand and 1 on himself, and she had stood close both times and paid attention the way a girl pays attention to something frightening but important. She knew what she was looking at. High chest, left side, below the collarbone. Messy entry, which meant the bullet had tumbled. No exit hole. Still in there. She looked at Ruthie. Boil the smallest knife in the kit, and the tweezers. Then don't watch. Ruthie boiled the instruments, and then turned to face the cave wall, with her arms crossed, standing sentry over her own composure. Barnaby held the lamp. Gwenna worked. It took 20 minutes she wouldn't think about afterward. Thad was deeply unconscious through most of it, which was the one mercy in the situation. The bullet had lodged against the back edge of the second rib, deflected rather than buried deep. She got it out clean. She packed the wound with strips of the cleanest cloth she could tear and bound it tight with the leather cord from Thad's own saddlebag. She sat back on her heels when it was done and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she washed them in the snow and fed the fire. He woke up 12 hours later. Gray early light at the cave mouth, the fire burned down to a steady bed of coals. Barnaby snoring against the wall with his hat over his face, and Ruthie curled into a ball under the horse blanket. Gwenna was sitting with her back against the granite, knees drawn up. The contract spread open across her legs. She heard his breathing change. She folded the contract and looked at him. His eyes were open, blue as January sky, tired and fever-glassed, but tracking cave, he said. Hunter's Cave, 2 miles east of the pass. He tried to push himself up and made it about 3 inches before his face went white. Don't, she said. He lay back. He turned his head toward her and saw the folded paper in her hands. The quiet in the cave was complete, except for the fire and Barnaby's slow breathing. You read it, he said. I read it. He closed his eyes, opened them again. Gwenna, did you look at me as a chubby girl? Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. She had expected it to break. Using this paper to turn me into a financial transaction? It landed in the room and sat there. Thad didn't look away from her. He didn't reach for words fast, the way a man does when he's constructing a defense. He just lay there and let the question be what it was, and looked at her face and breathed. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and quiet. When my father died, I read his letter, and I saw a name. He said, Mercer, Blackwood Pass, a debt. I thought about it the way you think about an obligation, something owed, something to be settled, something with a beginning and an end. A pause. I rode 4 months with that in my head. A duty. Gwenna waited. And then a blizzard put me face down in a snowbank, he said, and a woman I'd never met dragged me inside on a sled rug and kept me alive. Through a night I had no business surviving. He shifted slightly, a careful motion, and she brought me coffee. And she talked about cold air, making bread better, and making you grateful in a way that sticks, and she managed a cellar inventory in her head, and kept her accounts in the most precise handwriting I've ever seen, and used a cast iron skillet to back 3 armed men out of her own kitchen without raising her voice. He stopped. I was in this cookhouse 3 days before I learned her name, he said. 3 days of watching her and talking to her and sitting across her fire, and when Blackwood's men said Mercer, and I understood what that meant. He exhaled slow. I didn't say anything, because I was ashamed. Gwenna turned the folded contract in her hands. Ashamed of what, exactly? She said. Ashamed of the contract, or ashamed of me? Of the contract, his voice sharpened for the first time not at her, but at the thing itself, of a piece of paper that reduced you to a line item. I was ashamed that my family's idea of settling a debt was writing a woman's name in a ledger column. I was ashamed I hadn't burned it the moment I read it. He looked at her, entirely direct. I was not ashamed of you. I could never be ashamed of you. Gwenna looked at the fire. It crackled once and settled. I let myself believe, she said quietly. Up here in the pass, away from the women in Oakhaven and their opinions about what I am and what I ought to look like, I let myself start to believe that you saw me right, that it was real. She smoothed the edge of the folded paper. And then I found that it was real, he said. It is real. Gwenna, I fell in love with your soul before I knew your last name. Your smile, your gentleness, your generosity, the way you run this place with both hands and a sharp mind. The contract didn't give me those feelings. You did everything you did. She looked at him then. He reached out his right hand toward her. The left arm he couldn't lift. She looked at his hand for a moment, still rough from the kneading, still flour burned at the knuckle, and crossed the cave floor, and took it in both of hers. His grip was weak from the fever, but it closed around her hands. Give me the paper, he said. She put it in his hand. He turned his head toward the fire and threw it. The old parchment caught immediately, flaring bright at the edges, the wax seal bubbling and blackening. The legal language burned first, the ink going brown, and then gone. Then the paper itself, curling inward, and then nothing but ash and a briefly bright spark. Thad turned back to her. That paper was servitude, he said. You are a free, sweet, incredible woman. I stand here not to collect a debt, but to beg for a chance to love you. He couldn't technically stand. He was flat on his back on a cave floor with a bandaged bullet wound and a fever running at the edges. It didn't matter. What he said was what he meant, down to the last word, and Gwenna knew the difference between a man performing sincerity and a man standing in it. Her throat tightened. Her eyes went bright. She pressed her forehead down over their joined hands for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of what had just lifted. She believed him. She raised her head and looked at his face, fever pale and rough, with several days' beard, blue eyes, serious and steady. She pressed her palm once against his cheek, gentle and certain. "Rest," she said. "You're still running a fever, and that wound needs 2 more days before you move." "Is that a yes?" "That's a medical instruction." But the corner of her mouth turned up. "Rest first. We'll talk about the rest when you can stand without tipping over." He smiled then, real and warm and slightly exhausted. "Yes, ma'am." Behind them, Barnaby's snoring paused. "About time," the old man said from under his hat. Ruthie, still facing the cave wall, said nothing, but her shoulders relaxed. 3 days later, Thad was upright, not comfortable, and not fast. The wound pulled sharply on his left side with any sudden motion, and the cold didn't help, but his fever had broken overnight on the 2nd day. And by the 3rd morning, he was on his feet and arguing about whether he needed help crossing the cave to the fire. He didn't win the argument. Gwenna handed him the branch she'd shaped into a walking staff and told him to use it. He used it. The snow had lightened to a thin, intermittent fall, cold, still brutal, but navigable. Barnaby rode ahead on the horse to check the pass road and came back reporting what they already suspected. The cookhouse was gone. They went the next morning. What was left of it stood against the white landscape in a raw, black scar. The walls had mostly fallen inward, leaving the stone foundation and the iron stove standing in the open air, surrounded by charred timber and ash drifted over with 2 days of light snow. The lean-to was a framework of burned poles. The fence posts at the yard's edge were blackened to their bases. Gwenna stood at the edge of the yard and looked at all of it. Thad stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He put his right hand at the small of her back, just present, and let her look as long as she needed. Ruthie walked the perimeter in silence, counting damage with her eyes. Barnaby stood by the horse with his hat in his hands. Then Gwenna walked forward into the ruins. She moved carefully, testing the floor beneath the ash before each step, watching for hot spots and unstable timber. She went straight to where the kitchen had been, and then through the fallen wall toward the root cellar door. The cellar door was iron-framed. It had survived. "Help me with this," she said. Thad got the door with his good arm and pulled. The hinges protested, warped from the heat, but the door came up. Stone steps leading down. Cold air rising from below, carrying the smell of earth and preserved winter stores. The root cellar had held. Partially, some jars had cracked from the heat above, and 1 barrel of salt pork was ruined by smoke. But the stone walls had done their job, and most of the shelves still stood. And the floor was intact. Gwenna stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the packed earth floor for a long moment. Then she crossed to the northeast corner, furthest from the stairs, darkest corner, lowest point, and crouched down. She pressed both palms to the floor, felt along the seams of the packed earth. "Your father's name was Dan Mercer," Thad said from the stairs. It was. She pressed harder along a crack in the floor that ran too straight to be natural. "He died when I was 19, the town said. He stole from Blackwood's granary grain and silver coin that had been stored there for the winter." She pried at the crack with her fingernails. "He was run out before the circuit court could make the case formal. He died on the road to Cheyenne in a February storm." Her jaw tightened. "I was told he was a thief. I was told I carried that name. That was why I stopped using it." Thad stepped down into the cellar and came to her side. He took the small prying knife from his belt and worked it into the seam. A section of the floor came up, not soil underneath planking, old, dark, fitted, a hidden floor over a hidden space. and in that space a flat tin box wrapped in oilcloth that had kept out moisture and fire and time for the better part of a decade. Gwenna lifted it with both hands. She carried it to the foot of the stairs, where the light was better, and unwrapped the oilcloth. Tin opened cleanly. Inside, a leather-bound ledger, a folded letter written in her father's slanted hand, and beneath those, a second document on heavier stock official letterhead, two signatures at the bottom, dated November 1879. She read the ledger first, her father's handwriting. Careful, precise columns, dates, amounts, receipts, a full accounting of every bushel stored in Blackwood's granary that winter, with the corresponding payments received. Every figure documented, every transaction witnessed and noted. Dan Mercer had not stolen a grain. He had been the one person keeping an honest accounting of what was in the granary. Every discrepancy he'd caught, and he'd caught several, was written in the margins in red ink, with dates. Money going out that didn't match money coming in. Silver coin quantities that dropped between inventories with no corresponding transaction record. Blackwood had been stealing from his own granary, and Dan Mercer had been documenting it. Gwenna read the official document next. She read it twice. It was a land survey and mineral rights assessment, commissioned by a private firm and completed in October 1879, 2 months, before Blackwood had accused Dan Mercer of theft. The survey covered the land beneath Blackwood Pass cookhouse and the surrounding 200 acres. Silver deposit. Substantial. Assessed as commercially viable. Gwenna sat down the cellar step. Thad read over her shoulder. He was quiet for a long moment. He found out about the silver. Thad said, "Your father found the survey or heard about it, and Blackwood knew he knew. So he burned the granary himself," Gwenna said. She heard her own voice from a distance, flat and steady, because the alternative to steady was something she didn't have room for yet. Blamed my father for the missing silver, his own stolen silver, and ran him out before anyone could ask questions. And then your father hid this. Thad picked up the ledger carefully. He knew what he had. He just didn't have time to use it. She sat with that for a moment. 9 years of carrying her father's name like a shame. 9 years of being Dan Mercer's daughter in whispers. The thief's girl. The woman who ran a cookhouse at the top of a pass. Because she couldn't show her face in a proper town without someone bringing up what her father had done. Except her father hadn't done it. She thought about the women of Oakhaven. Their comments about her figure, their small cruelties about her corsets, the steady, years-long erosion of her standing in any room she walked into. She had always framed it as smallness, as people being petty and provincial and unkind. Now she turned it over in her mind and saw it differently. Blackwood ran Oakhaven. He had for years. His deputy was the law. His friends ran the businesses. His opinion set the social temperature of every gathering in a 20-mile radius. If Ephraim Blackwood wanted a woman's reputation reduced to rubble, he had all the tools necessary to do it quietly, over time, without ever appearing to do anything at all. Make her father a thief. Make her an outcast by association. Mock her figure in a town where his word was law and his allies would follow the lead. Make the isolation, the ridicule, the small daily humiliations add up to one obvious conclusion. Leave. Walk away from the land. Sell it cheap or simply abandon it and start somewhere else where nobody knew the name. She'd been too proud to leave, too rooted. Too much her mother's daughter and her father's. But she had carried the wounds regardless. The fat-shaming hadn't been careless cruelty. It had been calculated. Blackwood hadn't cared what she looked like. He had cared about what she owned, and he had used every available tool to make her feel like she deserved to lose it. "They told me I was wrong," she said quietly. "My whole life. People in that town told me I was too much too wide, too soft, too outside the fashionable shape of things. I thought it was just smallness, people being thoughtless." She pressed the ledger flat against her knees. "But Blackwood set the tone. He needed me gone, and making me believe I was lesser than making me ashamed to walk into a room that was how you move a woman without touching her. Thad was kneeling beside her now, at her level. He looked at her face. "And you didn't leave," he said. "I didn't leave. Despite all of it, this land is mine," she said. "My mother built the cookhouse. My father filed the claim. These hands maintained it." She looked at the ledger, at her father's precise handwriting in those careful columns, at the documented truth that had been buried in the dark for 9 years, waiting for someone to dig. You don't give that up because someone mocks your corset size. She stood up. Thad stood with her. "Your father also named in here," she said, handing him the letter from the tin. "The letter." "Third page," he read. The color left his face slowly and came back different. Sterling was in the letter. His father, James Sterling, had been Dan Mercer's witness. He had signed 2 of the granary receipts as a second-party observer. He had seen the silver survey. He had known what Blackwood was doing, and James Sterling had died in the autumn of 1880, a riding accident on the mountain road, according to Oakhaven's official record, thrown from his horse. They looked at each other in the half-light of the stone cellar. James Sterling hadn't died in a riding accident. "He killed them both," Gwenna said. Thad folded the letter carefully. He placed it back in the tin box. His hands were very controlled, very deliberate. "He's been sitting on a silver deposit and a railroad contract," Thad said, "and 2 dead men who knew the truth about both, and 1 woman who wouldn't leave." He looked at the oilcloth in Gwenna's hands. "Until March, when the circuit judge arrives and the railroad filing closes." Gwenna looked up the stairs, at the pale winter light coming through the open cellar door. The charred ruins above, the black snow-edged timbers, the iron stove standing in the open air. "He burned my home down to stop me from finding this," she said. "Yes." She wrapped the tin box back in its oilcloth. "Then we need to make sure he doesn't get another chance." She met Thad's eyes. "We need to be in Oakhaven before he knows we're coming." Barnaby's voice came down from the top of the stairs. "Horse is ready," he said. "Been ready since you went down." Ruthie's voice followed. "I packed the tin box's cloth in my coat. Dryer. There." Gwenna climbed the stairs out of the dark and into the cold morning air, the ledger under her arm, the tin box in her hands. She stood at the edge of the ruined cookhouse and looked at the white mountain road that led down into the valley toward Oakhaven. Her father's name was Dan Mercer, and he was an honest man. She was Gwenna Mercer, and her land was hers. And Ephraim Blackwood had exactly as long as it took 4 people and a horse to cover 12 miles of mountain road. She started walking. They came down the mountain road at first light. 4 of them, Gwenna in front, Thad on her right, with his wound bound tight under his coat, Barnaby leading the horse, Ruthie walking steady on the left, with the oilcloth tin tucked under her arm. 12 miles of packed snow and frozen creek crossings. They didn't talk much. The cold took their breath, and the road took their attention, and there wasn't much left over for conversation. Oakhaven came into view mid-morning, a valley town, wood-built and gray-roofed, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. The main street ran straight from the mill road to the church, and the town hall sat at the far end large for a frontier town, 2 stories, a covered porch, and double front doors that stood open even in the cold. Gwenna could hear the voices from half a block away. An auction. She knew the cadence of it before she made out the words, the flat, rhythmic call of a man working a crowd, and underneath it, the low murmur of townsfolk gathered and watching, and not objecting. They were auctioning her land. She stopped at the end of the street and looked at the town hall doors. "Give me the ledger," she said. Barnaby handed it over. She looked down at herself. 3 days in a cave and a 12-mile walk in winter hadn't done wonders for her appearance, but the buckskin dress she'd grabbed in the chaos of the fire kept rolled in her saddlebag, a good dress, fitted and clean, saved for exactly the kind of occasion that never seemed to come, had survived intact. She'd changed into it at the edge of town, behind the mill wall, while the others looked away. It fit her, the way good clothing fits this real body. over her hips and shoulders, and soft figure without apology, laced at the sides to accommodate her shape rather than fight it. She smoothed it once with her palm, lifted her chin. "Stay close," she said, and walked. The crowd inside the town hall turned when she came through the doors. Blackwood's land agent, a thin man in a city suit, stood at the podium at the front of the room with a sheaf of documents and a hammer. Blackwood himself stood off to the right, in his sheriff's coat and star, arms crossed maybe, 40 townspeople in the rows of chairs between. They saw her. The whispers started immediately. She heard them, and she walked anyway, straight down the center aisle, through the whispers and the turned heads and the small, mean sounds that followed her through the room. Her boots were steady on the plank floor. Her spine was straight. Her rosy cheeks were up. She had walked through worse than whispers. To get here. Blackwood straightened when he recognized her. His face went still. She got to the front of the room and stepped up beside the land agent without invitation. He moved sideways, startled. She set the ledger on the podium with a crack that rang through the hall. The auction went quiet. She looked out at the room. The faces she'd looked at her whole life, the women from the mercantile, the church-going men, the neighbors she had fed through 3 hard winters. They looked back at her with mixed expressions. Some uncomfortable, some still smirking. A few she couldn't read at all. She had thought about what to say for 12 miles. She was done thinking. "You laugh at my curves because I don't cinch a corset," she said. Her voice carried clearly from the front of the room to the back. Steady, no apology in it. "But these hands baked the bread that fed your children through the winter. My warmth is life. Your ingratitude is the real defect." The room went very still. She put her hand flat on the ledger. "This is my father's accounting record," she said. Dan Mercer's full documentation of every bushel stored in Blackwood's granary in the winter of 1879. Every figure, every date, every transaction. She opened the ledger to the red ink margin notes, including every discrepancy amounts that went missing with no record silver coin that disappeared between inventories. She looked up. "My father didn't steal from that granary. He caught the man who did." She looked directly at Blackwood. He hadn't moved. His face was a careful blank, the face of a man deciding whether he's threatened. Ephraim Blackwood burned his own granary," Gwenna said. "Framed my father, ran him out into a February storm, and buried the truth long enough to make the whole town believe it." She held the ledger up so the room could see the pages. 19 years. "That's how long this has been buried under my root cellar floor." She set it back on the podium. "And this morning, I dug it up." One of the women in the front row, the mercantile keeper's wife, who had made the corset comments, at least a dozen times put her hand over her mouth. Others were looking at Blackwood now. That was new. Usually they looked at him for guidance. Now they were looking at him for answers. He smiled, thin and controlled. "The woman is delusional," he said to the room. "Grief-stricken. Her property burned down. She's been out in the cold. Her father was a documented thief, and this is the daughter of a documented thief making claims that—" "We also have the mineral survey," Gwenna said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Land survey dated October 1879, she said. "Commissioned privately. Silver deposit under the Blackwood Pass acreage. Assessed as commercially viable." She paused. "Dated 2 months before my father was accused." She looked at the room. "Which means Blackwood knew what was under my family's land before he destroyed my family." The room's temperature changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic, no outcry, no gasps. Just a shift, collective and unmistakable, as 40 people recalculated something they thought they'd understood for 19 years. Blackwood's careful smile tightened at the edges. "This auction is legal and properly filed," he said to the land agent beside him. "Proceed." The land agent looked at the ledger, at Gwenna, at the room. He set his hammer down on the table. "I don't think so," he said quietly. The back doors of the town hall opened. Thad came in first, moving carefully with his wound but upright and clear-eyed. Behind him walked three men Gwenna recognized as veterans from the Valley Farms, gray-haired, solid men who had known her father. And behind them, in a dark traveling coat, with a leather satchel under his arm, came a compact, precise-looking man with spectacles and the unhurried bearing of someone who had presided over difficult rooms before. The circuit judge had arrived. His name was Aldrich Cobb. He'd ridden up the South Road that morning, 2 days ahead of his scheduled arrival, delayed the previous week by a storm and catching up now. Thad had met him at the livery stable while Gwenna walked the main street. 20 minutes of documents and ledger pages was enough. Judge Cobb had come to see for himself. He walked to the front of the room and set his satchel on the edge of the podium beside Gwenna's ledger. "I'm told there's a land auction in progress," he said. "There was," the land agent said. Cobb opened his satchel and removed a folded document. "I'm also told there's an outstanding mineral rights claim attached to this acreage, filed by a Daniel Mercer in November 1879, and never legally discharged." He looked at Blackwood over his spectacles. "Sheriff, you want to explain the chain of custody on that filing?" Blackwood's jaw worked. He looked at the room, the people in it. He looked at Ledger and the survey, and the judge and Thad standing at the back with three men who had known what kind of man James Sterling was. He looked at Gwenna at the podium. He went for his gun. It came out fast. Gwenna gave him that. Practiced. Clean draw. She grabbed the lamp from the edge of the podium and slung it sideways. Not the lamp itself, the oil cup underneath, shallow and hot, the tallow liquefied from 2 hours of burning. It hit Blackwood's gun hand in a solid splash of hot grease, and he dropped the weapon with a sharp, involuntary sound, his hand slicked and burning. The gun clattered on the floor. Thad crossed the room in 6 steps. He got Blackwood's arm behind his back and put him down across the front table, hard and final, and Barnaby came up from the side door with the iron cuffs from Blackwood's own deputy's belt. The room was on its feet. Then it went very quiet. Judge Cobb looked at the overturned lamp, at Blackwood's cuffed wrists, at the oil spreading across the front table, and at Gwenna, standing with her hand still at the angle of the throw. "I see," he said. He adjusted his spectacles and turned to the room. "I'll need these documents entered into the record. I'll need testimony from anyone with direct knowledge of the granary fire of 1879. He picked up the ledger, "and I'll need this room cleared of everyone except material witnesses." He looked at Blackwood, who was upright now between Thad and Barnaby, face rigid and eyes burning with something past fury into something colder. "Sheriff Blackwood," he said, "you are relieved of your badge pending investigation. Anything you say from this moment will be entered into the record." Blackwood said nothing. Thad unclipped the star from Blackwood's coat and set it on the table, face down. What came after was less dramatic than the moment before it, but in some ways it mattered more. The testimony took 2 hours. The veterans spoke first. They had known James Sterling, had known Dan Mercer, had always thought the granary fire smelled wrong, but hadn't said so because Blackwood was the law, and saying so cost more than they'd had. A cattle hand from the South Valley produced his own copy of a receipt from the Mercer granary stores, countersigned and dated, that he'd held onto out of some private instinct for 17 years. One by one, the picture built. Gwenna sat beside Judge Cobb's table and answered every question with the ledger open in front of her. She pointed to figures. She cited dates. She spoke clearly and without heat, the way a woman speaks when she no longer needs to convince anyone of anything, when the documents do the convincing. And she is simply the person who survived long enough to bring them to the room. The townspeople in the chairs had gone through several expressions over 2 hours. Discomfort first, then something closer to shame. A few of the women from the mercantile couldn't quite look at her. The church-going men sat with their hats in their hands. She didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. These were neighbors. Mostly not malicious, mostly just credulous people who had followed the loudest authority in the room for so long that following it had become automatic. What they needed now wasn't judgment. They needed the ledger and the truth in time to understand what they'd been part of. At the close of the session, Judge Cobb signed the preliminary order. The auction filing was voided. The mineral rights claim was restored to the Mercer estate. A formal inquiry into the granary fire of 1,879 and the deaths of Dan Mercer and James Sterling would open in the spring term. Blackwood was walked out of the town hall by the veterans. When the doors closed behind him, the room let out a long collective breath. Then it went quiet again. The quiet of people who have a lot of private reckoning to do. Ruthie appeared at Gwenna's elbow. She had been sitting in the back through all of it, the tin box in her lap, watching with calm, appraising eyes. "Good throw," she said. "The grease." "Thank you," Gwenna said. "I could have done it," Ruthie said, "but you were closer." Spring came to Blackwood Pass, the way it always did, slowly. Then suddenly, first, the light changed, going from the flat white of winter to something warmer, and the snow on the pine branches started to fall in heavy clumps through the middle of the day. Then the creek under the east ridge opened up, a sound they heard from the pass before they could see the water. Then the mud season, which was its own particular misery, and then the first green at the edges of the tree line. By April, the new building was up. Thad had done the framing through March with 2 carpenters he'd hired from Cheyenne, men who worked fast and straight and didn't cut corners on the joints. Barnaby supervised with the authority of a man who has watched construction done wrong enough times to know exactly what right looks like. Ruthie handed tools and remembered where everything had been set down, which turned out to be the most valuable skill on the whole job. Gwenna designed the interior from memory and from the improvements she'd always meant to make on the original cookhouse and never had the resources to do. The kitchen was larger, with 2 iron stoves and a bread oven built into the stone wall, with a proper damper. The dining room had 8 tables instead of 4. The back rooms were sized for actual beds, good ones, with real frames and proper mattresses, 4 of them, for travelers and for the children she'd already begun inquiring about through the county orphan board. Little Ruthie, she should mention, had opinions about the bed arrangement. Firm opinions. Ruthie's opinions were incorporated. The day they hung the new shingle over the door, Mercer House, Blackwood Pass, painted in Barnaby's careful block letters, the spring air carried the smell of pine sap and thawed earth and the first real warmth in months. Gwenna stood in front of it and looked up at the letters. Mercer, her name back on a door in a place it belonged. She and Thad married on a Saturday in late April, with Judge Cobb presiding. The judge had stayed through the spring term to close out the inquiry, and he performed the ceremony in the new dining room with 8 people present, Barnaby and Ruthie, the 2 carpenters who had stayed for the raising, an elderly trapper who had wintered in the area and become a regular at breakfast, and 2 women from Oakhaven who had come separately and quietly, without announcement, bringing food in what Gwenna understood to be an approximation of apology. The ceremony was short. The vows were plain. Neither of them was given to elaborate speeches. What Gwenna remembered from it afterward was Thad's hands holding hers and the way he looked at her, not with the performing look of a man trying to appear sincere, but with the quiet, uncomplicated look of someone who has found the right place and knows it. He looked at her soft face and her rosy cheeks and her warm dark eyes, and he looked at all of it with the same appreciation. She wore a blue wool dress she'd made herself, fitted to her real shape, and she wore it the way she stood at her own podium, square-shouldered and unashamed, entirely herself. The children started arriving in May. 2 girls from the Laramie County Board, sisters, 7 and 9, who had been passed between households for 2 years and arrived on the stage looking like they were waiting to be disappointed again. A boy from Cheyenne, 12, who had worked cattle since he was 8 and was suspicious of indoor spaces and regular meals. A baby, technically, placed temporarily through a church circuit and then permanently through the county, who slept through most of the first month in a cradle Barnaby built from pine scraps on a Tuesday afternoon without being asked. Ruthie managed the newcomers with the authority of a seasoned hand. She showed the sisters where everything was kept and explained the rules, Gwenna's rules, practical and fair, with actual reasons behind them. She gave the 12-year-old boy the sheep to look after, which was the correct move because animals respond to competence without asking where you came from. By June, Mercer House smelled the way the old cookhouse had smelled bread and wood smoke and coffee and something baked with cinnamon that permeated the walls and didn't leave. Gwenna had rebuilt exactly what she'd always had, and she had built it bigger. She accepted her own body, the way she had finally come to understand it, not as something to apologize for or cinch into someone else's preferred shape, but as the body that had dragged a dying man through a blizzard on a sled rug, that had worked dough for hours in a cold kitchen, to feed people through a hard winter, that had carried a ledger down a mountain road and stood in front of a room full of doubt and spoken without flinching. It was a body that did real things in the real world, and it looked exactly like that body was supposed to look. Thad never gave her a reason to think about it any other way. He adored her, plainly, consistently, without an audience. He said so, in ordinary moments, over the breakfast dishes and the supply ledger and the Tuesday evening bread, and he showed it in the steady way he moved through the house, aware of where she was, quietly present in whatever room she occupied. On an evening in late June, the kitchen was warm and golden from the bread oven, and the new building held the smell of a good supper finished, and the sound of children in the back rooms settling toward sleep. Barnaby was on the porch. Ruthie was reading to the sisters, which she did every evening and pretended was purely practical. Gwenna stood at the bread oven, checking the last round of the day, and Thad came up behind her and wrapped both arms around her from behind, his chin resting at her temple, his arms easy around her soft waist. She leaned back into him. Outside the window, the last light was going gold over the pass. The mountain, still and green and enormous against the evening sky. He pressed a kiss to her rosy cheek. "I thought I was lost in a snowstorm," he said. "But God used that blizzard to lead me to the only place on earth with true love and warmth." Gwenna put her hands over his. The bread oven glowed. The children settled. The pass held its long evening quiet, the way it always had, patient and permanent, keeping watch over the small, warm light in the building below. She was home. If this story stayed with you, I want you to sit with that feeling for just a moment longer. Because Gwenna Mercer's story isn't really about a blizzard. It isn't really about a cowboy or a locked iron box or a corrupt sheriff. It's about something far more personal than any of that. It's about what happens when the world's years telling you that you are too much, too wide, too soft, too loud, in a body that doesn't fit the shape they've decided is acceptable, and you choose to stay anyway. You keep the fire burning. You feed the people who come to your door cold and hungry. You do the work with your hands and your mind and your whole stubborn heart, even when nobody is watching, even when nobody says thank you, even when the women in town whisper behind their gloves every time you walk past. Gwenna never needed the town's approval to be remarkable. She needed a blizzard to prove it, and even then, the proof was already there in every loaf of bread, every warm quilt, every jar she'd cataloged in that root cellar by lamplight. She had been extraordinary all along. The town just hadn't been paying the right kind of attention. Here is what I hope you take from her story. The people who mock your body, your size, your shape, they are not seeing you. They are seeing something they've decided to use against you. And there is a difference, a vast and important difference, between someone who genuinely doesn't understand your worth and someone who understands it perfectly well and wants you to doubt it, so you'll walk away from what belongs to you. Blackwood didn't shame Gwenna. because he thought she was lesser. He shamed her because he knew she was powerful, and he needed her to forget it. Don't forget it. Your worth is not in your waistline. It is in what your hands have built, in who you've kept warm, in the fires you've refused to let go out, even when the storm was loudest. A body that does real things in the real world is exactly the body it's supposed to be. Gwenna figured that out standing in a burned-down cookhouse in January with a ledger under her arm and 12 miles of mountain road ahead of her. You don't have to wait that long. And if you've been carrying someone else's cruelty around like it was the truth about you, I hope this story gives you permission to set it down. It was never yours to carry. Thank you for spending this time in Blackwood Pass with Gwenna, with Thad, with old Barnaby and little Ruthie, and the found family they built out of stubbornness and warmth and the kind of love that doesn't ask you to be smaller than you are. If their story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I'll see you at the next one. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary and created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental.